Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Welcome to our Getzen lecture. I'm Matthew Auer. I'm the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs here at UGA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 annual Getzen lecture on government accountability. This annual lecture series honors Evangeline Sveres Getzen and Forrest William Getzen, lifelong advocates of public service and education. Getzen family members have been long-standing and generous supporters of this annual lecture series, and we're deeply grateful for that. So government accountability, that's the title of our lecture series that we've had for a number of years. Government accountability is a little bit like public safety, I would say. We respond in the affirmative when we're asked if we care about it. And in fact, we insist on it. Yet we often take government accountability for granted, or we expect somebody else to make sure that accountable government is actually happening. Well, for more than 3 decades, Shelley Metzenbaum has been doing just that, and from every imaginable angle. In the late 1980s, she was the director of the Office of Capital Planning and Budgeting for Massachusetts. In an era of major subway construction and the Big Dig in the Boston metro region alone, where many billions of dollars were spent on public infrastructure, you wanted someone like Dr. Metzenbaum keeping the relevant agencies and politicians and contractors honest. The same was true of major environmental responsibilities that she had in Massachusetts, including her outstanding work on the reform of that state's Superfund hazardous waste remediation program. Her environmental portfolio expanded during the Clinton administration, where she managed EPA's 10 regional offices and the agency's responsibilities with states and localities. For President Obama, she was Associate Director of Performance and Personnel Management at the Office of Management and Budget, which was another huge assignment. Her experience and accomplishments allowed her to stand out as the obvious first choice to serve as the president of the Volcker Alliance. The Volcker Alliance is a nonpartisan organization founded by the legendary Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, and it focuses on government performance and effective public management at all levels. Dr. Metzenbaum was the founding president of the Volcker Alliance. So we're thrilled to host Dr. Metzenbaum today. Her talk is entitled Accountability. What does it mean? Constructively managing it and avoiding the blame and claim game. Please join me in welcoming Shelley Metzenbaum.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Catherine and the Getzen family and the Willoughby family. So I'm delighted to be here. Accountability is important. So is being accountable. I'm guessing University of Georgia believes that because you do this annual lecture on the topic. I'm guessing those of you in this room believe that because you're here. But what is accountability? What does it mean to be accountable? What does it mean to hold someone or an organization accountable? Those are the topics I want to explore with you today. Beyond that, though, I want to explore more closely the actions we take to boost accountability, what I'll call the accountability mechanisms. Because from my experience, and frankly, from the research evidence, many of those actions don't work well, don't work at all, or even worse, they actually can impair accountability and performance improvement on multiple dimensions. I'll just expand a little bit about what those dimensions are. One is impact or effectiveness or the comparative effectiveness of the programs, the government programs we put in place, cost effectiveness, fairness, procedural justice, service quality, process efficiency, avoiding collateral damage, and building understanding of and trust in government. Those are the dimensions of performance I think we want to improve, along with accountability. But what is accountability? My goal today is to inspire you, and I hope enlist you, in taking advantage of rapidly evolving technology and analytics advances and other advances in other evidence building and evidence sharing methods to boost accountability and other dimensions of performance that we care about. My goal is really to inspire and enlist you in that effort. And it's my assumption that you're here because you want to make a difference. You want to make the world a better place. So I hope to give you a sense of the tools for doing that and what I consider the power tools for accountability. So let me start with 4 examples to begin exploring the meaning of the term accountability and accountable. Harvey Weinstein, a lot of talk about holding Harvey Weinstein accountable for egregiously bad behavior. So accountability clearly is about punishing people for bad behavior and trying to deter future bad behavior. But when Walter Schaub of the Office of Government Ethics spoke 3 years ago here about accountability, he talked about conflicts of interest and trying to make sure that the people who are able to use the tools, resources, authority, power of government serve the people and not themselves. When Congressman Ocasio-Garcia tweeted about accountability a few weeks ago after the Iowa Democratic caucus, she basically said, if this reporting is correct, there needs to be accountability at the DNC. What did she mean? Was she calling for the DNC to assume responsibility for running primaries in all the states? Or was she calling for someone at the DNC to be punished? Or something else? Consider a 4th example, the opioid abuse crisis in this country. How was it possible for the opioid prescription rate in 2006 to exceed 100 prescriptions per 100 people per year, with a high of 129.9 prescriptions in West Virginia per year? How can that happen? Who, if anyone, in government or elsewhere, should have been accountable for noticing and perhaps for taking action to bring down these absurdly high rates of opioid prescription? Was it the local government's accountability, the state governments, the federal governments, or somebody else? And if in the federal government, who? The Food and Drug Administration, it turns out, in 2003, did sue pharma for the OxyContin for misadvertising, for advertising that it wasn't addictive. And they sued, and they won the suit, and they settled, $600,000 fine, I believe. But did it really deter any of the overprescription? Not if you look at the numbers. At the same time, ironically, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services had established patient surveys to build accountability. So as part of these patient surveys, they added what people had realized was important was pain management, and they added survey questions on pain management into the data they used to determine hospital value-based payments. In other words, like as one expert in the field said, oh yeah, the hospitals were definitely pushing the opioids because they wanted to score well on this patient survey. So what do? What does accountability look like in this situation? Should government organizations be accountable for detecting problems such as the astonishing surge in opioid prescription rate? Or should they be accountable for taking action to bring down the problems, to reduce the problems? And what happens when multiple parts of government are taking actions that don't pull in the same direction? They're dealing with different, both laudable goals, but they're not consistent with one another. Where's the accountability there? We talk about accountability and accountable a lot when we talk about government. But what do we mean? Do we mean some of the things I've said, all of them, a subset, or none of the above? So let's continue to explore this a little bit further and talk a little bit about the accountability mechanisms. And I want to talk about something that a number of you in this room have personal experience with, which is school accountability, right? So in the 1960s and 1970s, the federal government did 2 laws, the first one in the 60s where they provided funding to get states and localities to change their goals. The 1965 law was about getting states to pay attention to high poverty, high minority populations, and worry about education quality. The 1970 law was to get states to pay attention to the education needs of the differently abled. Okay? It worked. States started to pay more attention. Is federal funding tied to a goal to get someone, another entity to adopt a goal? Is that accountability? I'm not sure it is. But maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Those are the kinds of questions we probably need to think about, talk about, and decide when we're taking actions to boost accountability. In the 1990s, and since then, we've had 3 laws to boost school accountability, and that's where many of you came in. How many of you had to get tested in school, right? A lot of you, right? And that was about the federal government saying it's not just about getting you to adopt the goals. We want every state to adopt their own set of goals in addition to those to serve special sort of subsets of the populations, especially those who are being not served before. But we want you to set goals, measure performance, and then use the data to boost accountability in the system. And the 2001 law, No Child Left Behind, included within it mandated frequencies for that measurement and punishment if you weren't making adequate yearly progress. Now, those laws have definitely succeeded in increasing state generation of educational performance data. They've also improved school performance in some places for some populations at some times. Unquestionably, more study can and should be done to look at how these different accountability mechanisms worked and how they affected the students, the teachers, the school systems, the communities. We need to learn from this experience about which accountability mechanisms work well when and which don't. Let me also say we ought to pay attention to when these accountability mechanisms backfire. So let me just run down a list that you're probably all familiar with in terms of how some of these school accountability mechanisms backfired. Teaching to the test, have you heard about it? So you had a lot of schools that had some very exciting programs that felt they had to drop them, even though nobody necessarily said they had to, but they wanted to make sure they did well on these school accountability scores, right? So the teaching to the test may have compromised growth in the non-measured areas. Measurement manipulation. 2007, a Dallas Morning News reporter was doing looking at the school data and realized that some of those scores were really funky. They were jumping up and down, and he couldn't understand it. So he started to look at it, and he then went into the schools and did some interviews to figure out what was going on, and he learned that some of the teachers were standing over the students' desks while they took the tests until they got the right answer. Measurement manipulation, doesn't build your accountability, it undermines the accountability. So that scandal was revealed. You would think perhaps the state would have, or the school district would have taken actions and the problem would have been fixed. That was a 2007 study. I Googled it a few days ago to sort of make sure I got my facts right. And lo and behold, in 2012, the Atlanta newspaper did another study finding the same kind of measurement manipulation in the Dallas schools. And then finally, the district started to actually look at the data to see where there were statistical anomalies that might raise questions, and discovered that one of their award-winning elementary schools had cheated their way to the top. And the Dallas schools weren't alone. ProPublica's done a great study, did a great article on a bunch of the biggest cheating scandals, measurement cheating scandals in the schools. So these states, some states, and hopefully all states, are now starting to get smarter and using statistical analysis to figure out where the anomalies are that they should be asking questions about. In fact, in Dallas, once they found this, they fired some of the staff and teachers. But we need to, what is accountability here? It's partly honesty. Measurement manipulation also doesn't just undermine the credibility and integrity of the system, it can be unbelievably unfair. There is a wonderful book called Weapons of Math Destruction, okay, written by a data scientist who worries about gaming and the integrity and how data analysis can impair democracy and fairness. And she tells a story about a teacher in the DC public schools who was totally respected by the parents, loved by the parents, and considered fantastic by her supervisors. One described her as one of the best teachers I've ever seen, who, when Mathematica did a data analysis to look at the value add of all the teachers, determined that this teacher was one of the lowest scoring teachers in the school, and she got fired. Well, she was a good enough teacher, and happily she's still teaching, just not in the District of Columbia. But she was a good enough teacher that she tried to figure out what was going on, and then she remembered, as she had been preparing that year, at the beginning of that year, for her incoming class, she was really excited because 29% of the students in her class had scored, in the incoming class, had scored at the advanced reading level. 29%, which was 5 times the district average. Then she remembered that when those students actually showed up at the beginning of the year, almost none of them could read very well. So the prior year teacher had basically gamed the system, and this teacher paid the penalty. And there was no good appeal process. It was behind a model and all of that. Not only is there intentional measurement manipulation, but there's oftentimes very bad design of the measurement systems that leads to unfairness. So I mentioned that this prior year teacher measured at the end of the year. Many of the school accountability tests were done, you guys lived it, I don't know, but many of them were done at the end of the year. What's the purpose of end of the year school data? Think about that. What's the purpose? Is it to help the teacher figure out how to help the kid and know where their strengths and weaknesses are so they can adjust their curriculum accordingly and maybe even do precision interventions with each child? Clearly not if you're doing it at the end of the year. So maybe the end of the year data is to help a next year's teacher figure out where a child's strengths and weaknesses are. Oh, that worries me a little bit. Why does it worry me? It worries me because, have you ever heard of the Pygmalion effect? The Pygmalion effect, that's research that finds that teacher expectations for children actually become predictive, because if you think a child is going to do poorly, they tend to do less well because the teacher teaches down to them. Oh, great. So now I'm about to give the upcoming year's teachers data that says this kid's not going to do well. What if that kid was in the midst of a really difficult time, was sick when they tested? So we've just created a system that's adding risks. I don't think that's very accountable. Or I'll talk to you about the Head Start designation renewal system. Any of you know Head Start? It serves 1 million kids a year, high poverty, other kinds of vulnerabilities, a fabulous program. And for years, Head Start grantees automatically got rolled over. The next year grant was their grant. They got it, okay? And then a bunch of people decided, and I signed off on this, I will admit I was part of the policy sign-off team, that, hey, let's get some market mechanisms. You all have learned about market mechanisms at this school, right? Let's introduce some market mechanisms into the system so every Head Start grantee will have to recompete their grant every 5 years, or we will give 5-year grants. And the bottom 10% of grantees will have to recompete. Sounds intuitively appealing. Problem? There's actually no good way to fairly compare the Head Start programs. So they came up with a system that used a measurement system designed to help teachers, supervisors of teachers, help the teachers figure out where their weaknesses were and design their developmental programs. But that was used to compare Head Start programs. Great. Oh, and by the way, it was a single observer it's an observational measure, who would come into your classroom. Now, what if you happen to have a new teacher and they come into the classroom and observe the teacher at the beginning of the school year? Chances are you're not going to do as well as if they had observed at the end of the school year. And then the way they set it up, they did cohort analysis. So we're going to get this group of Head Start programs this year, this group next year, this group next year. Well, if I happen to be in the cohort that's got a few Nobel Prize winners, you know, I'm going to be in the bottom 10% as opposed to if I happen to be in a cohort that has less, you know, strong Head Start programs. So instead of using a moving average, who I was compared to actually made a huge difference. So there was a retrospective analysis done of the first 3 cohorts that got analyzed. 74% of those designated in the bottom 10%, when they appealed, they were basically, they had their grants restored in full or in part. So think about all the time and effort that went into fighting this erroneous designation of being in the bottom 10% that could have gone into trying to figure out how do we help the teachers help the kids thrive. Now, to the credit of the Office of Head Start, they've recognized this as a problem and they're moving to redesign the accountability system. Now, one problem I should mention about both the K-12 and the Head Start program is notice how they focused on not doing one. The K-12 was you didn't make adequate yearly progress. That was when you got penalized. Head Start, it was the bottom 10%. Who's looking at the top 10% to figure out, compared to demographic peers, is doing better, that might be doing something we should learn and try in other places to see if it can be replicated, and if so, roll out. So I don't know if any of you know that Johnny Mercer song, Accentuate the Positive, right? We ain't doing that. Now let me jump over to talk briefly about sort of the last year's lecturer, Gene Dodaro, head of the General Accountability Office, U.S. General Accountability Office, and the work, what he talked about last year, and the work of the GAO. Gene spoke, I thank you for having all of these lectures online. Gene spoke about risk reduction and cost savings. In fact, his final comment was, GAO is all about helping save money. Well, that sounds great. So now I got risk identification and prioritization, risk reduction, cost savings, avoiding conflicts of interest. Are all of these things accountability? Maybe. I've got goals, measurement, you know. So how does this work? Is that what accountability is? I should mention GAO changed its name from the U.S. General Accounting Office to the U.S. General Accountability Office. Okay, so what did that name change mean? What's in a name, right? So I went to the GAO website to find out, and it says, to better reflect the modern professional services organization GAO has become, today our agency that once checked millions of vouchers has become a multidisciplinary organization equipped to handle Congress's toughest audit and evaluation assignments. Okay, so it's about being an auditor or doing evaluations. So let's look a little bit at audits. So what are audits? Audits, you go check and make sure people report on what they're doing, and honestly and openly. It's pretty much the honesty, integrity of the record-keeping systems. But what's really happening is that the audit and oversight infrastructure is currently overwhelming the performance-improving infrastructure of government. And what do I mean by that? Well, 2018 survey of R&D grant recipients from federal grants, a 2008 survey found that 44% of their time was being spent on administrative matters rather than on advancing the purpose of the grant. I am sure if a similar study was done of the states, localities, and other nonprofits, you would find something similar. You've got layer upon layer upon layer of both auditors and inspector generals and monitors, as well as paperwork. You've got paperwork. There are 155 pages of the Uniform Grant Guidance, 270 different provisions of it, 12 appendices, 47 pages, and that's complemented by a 1,600-page compliance supplement for that combines all of the different agency-specific compliance obligations. If I'm a grantee, I'm going to have to take a course on my compliance obligations and how to report and meet them before I can even start to think about actually advancing the purpose of my grant. And that is a problem. So maybe we got to redefine what we mean by that, but wait, GAO actually has a whole nother definition of what it means by accountability. If I look at its annual performance and accountability report, the most recent was 2019, what does it mean to say a program works? I'm sorry. What is the GAO report? I'm not going to go into evaluation. I could do a whole nother riff on that, but I can do that later if you want me to. What does GAO say it's going to work on? Well, if I look at it, it says in the annual accountability report, accountability is one of GAO's 6 core values, and accountability is about enhancing the economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and credibility of the federal government. So they're trying to define it. But whoa, I got to tell you, some bells and whistles and warning sounds were going off in my brain. Why? Because GAO mentioned economy and efficiency before effectiveness. And as you recall, Jean Dodaro talked about cost savings. That is what GAO is all about. And then when I look at the performance report, the performance indicators, the first 2 performance indicators I see are about cost savings, right? So GAO saved $215 billion in financial benefit in 2019, returning $38 for every dollar GAO spent. Well, clearly with those performance indicators, GAO is sending the message that efficiency and economy are what's more important than effectiveness. But how can any organization be efficient or economical if they're not first effective? If you really want to save money and you're not effective, just, pack it up and go home. So you've got the order of things wrong. But then let's look and say, okay, if you're using these performance indicators and you're claiming this kind of savings, $338 billion per dollar spent, over $200 billion in savings, was it? What does that mean? If GAO says those are its savings, what about the agencies? Does the agency get to claim the savings too? Is that now a double counting problem? Should the agency get to keep those savings, or since GAO found it, should the agency actually have to give those savings back? Well, if it has to give those savings back, it's not going to want to do any of the savings. So you've got this problem, this dynamic problem. You've got to figure out how to make it work well. So what about GAO? Is GAO providing this information to show it's worth its cost? Probably. It's a good argument to make to Congress, but is it trying also to show that it does better every year? Well, that's great, except I'm guessing that's not the case, because I see that GAO set a target for 2020 that it would save $50 billion next year after saving $200 billion plus the prior year. So what is the purpose of setting the target? Now, what we know from a lot of research, a robust body of research, is that if you set a stretch target, a few, not a lot, a few stretch targets, think Kennedy's man on the moon in a decade, if you set a few such targets, it will focus people, it will energize people and organizations, and it will stimulate them to innovate so they, in fact, get better return on their dollar. But that's not what GAO did. It had a $215 billion actual and, set a $50 billion target. Well, maybe it's trying to sort of show that it can beat its targets and motivate continual improvement. But when I actually looked at the historic numbers, $50 billion is less than its performance in any of the last 6 years. And beyond that, GAO was wise enough to realize that $215 billion came from 2 specific projects that had this huge impact, so they do a 4-year moving average on their numbers. But they didn't use the 4-year moving average for their targets. So what's the purpose of this? Now, let me be clear. I think very highly of Gene Dodaro, of the General Accountability Office, and of all the people I've ever met who work there. But I think we got a systemic problem that's got to be fixed if we really want accountability to work and not get people to do dumb things. Now, you may think, what is she saying? Does she think we shouldn't set goals? Does she think we shouldn't measure performance? Does she think we shouldn't report it? Au contraire, man. That's what I do for a living, right? That's what I advocate all the time. But I think we need to get people to be, governments, to be clear about what they're trying to accomplish, to measure performance and other information that will help them figure out how to improve. Use the data to figure out how to improve, and don't use the data in ways that are going to make people afraid of it. So let me just mention a few examples here. The Charles River, it's a small river that runs between Boston and Cambridge. And in 1995, the EPA regional administrator, Environmental Protection Agency regional administrator, set a goal. The Charles River would be swimmable in 10 years. Now, that may sound reasonable. I mean, actually, it was seemed laughable to a lot of people at the time, because if you were a rower on the river at many of the universities along the river, you had to get a tetanus shot if you fell in, and nobody thought anything about that. The Standells had written a song called Love That Dirty Water, right? So, and then I used to drive along and see this thing called Magazine Beach, and it was a building, and when I dropped my kids off at school, and I laughed that there was ever a beach. But this regional administrator, like Kennedy with his Man on the Moon in the Decade, he loved the Charles River. He wanted it to be swimmable in 10 years. So he set the goal, and he was smart enough to set it on the eve of the head of the Charles Regatta, when the newspaper was paying attention, when 250,000 people came to the river. He set that goal, and then you know what he did next? He turned to one of the people in the regional office, a guy who was a lawyer, who was acting as a special assistant, and he said, "You're in charge. It's your job to get that goal met." A guy named Ken Morath. And what did Ken do? Well, the first thing he had to figure out was what swimmable meant, right? You know, and if you know anybody who's ever worked at the EPA, the scientists there go nuts in terms of what swimmable is. But Ken decided not to sweat it. Oh, why? The second thing he did is he recruited two engineers to work with him, all three of them part-time, by the way. And then they did a logical thing. They went in search of the data. Now, the state EPA didn't collect data about the water quality of the Charles River. EPA collected data about the compliance, whether or not permit dischargers were meeting their permit conditions. EPA collected data about how many inspections it was doing on the river, how many enforcement actions it was taking, and maybe or maybe not the dollar value of the enforcement actions. But it didn't collect that water quality data. The state, Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, was actually a national leader at the time in measuring water quality and doing what was called watershed management, realizing you needed to look at all of the waters contributing to a water body. And so they did this watershed management work, and they, once every 5 years, they would go out and measure water quality along in the Charles River watershed. The next, year 1 was the measurement, year 2 was the plan, years 3 and 4 implement, year 5, let's see how we're doing, and then decide what we're going to do next. Well, if Ken Morath was going to make that 10-year goal, these 5-year measurements, they just weren't actionable enough. They weren't frequent enough, right? So you had to figure that out. Ken discovered that the Charles River Watershed Association had started to, he probably knew it already, had started to send out a corps of volunteers to 37 points along the 80-mile stretch of the river once a month to measure on 2 parameters: fecal coliform, otherwise known as poop, and dissolved oxygen, which is those algae blooms, is the cause of the algae blooms. And Ken decided, even though it was volunteer data and people were worried that it wasn't good enough, that he was going to look at what the data said. He wasn't trying to use it for an enforcement action. He wasn't trying to use it to set a regulation. He just wanted to know what he could learn from the data. Lo and behold, he discovered a downstream monitoring reading with worse water quality than an upstream reading. So what did he do? He looked to see if there was a permitted discharger in between. There wasn't. So what did he do? He asked why, right? He asked why. So he couldn't figure it out, so he called the state. The state looked, they said, we don't know why. So what did he do? He calls the Boston Water and Sewer Commission. They can't figure it out. So Ken says, let's pull your maps, let's go walk the pipes. They walked the pipes, and they found an illegal hookup to the storm sewer that should have been hooked up to the sanitary sewer and gone into the treatment system to get cleaned up. But instead, it was going straight into the river. Now, Ken tells me that, in fact, rowers had been calling to complain about the junk coming out of the outflow pipes that they were seeing, but he had made a determination that it probably was trivial, and it would have required a lawsuit against a locality, and EPA doesn't like to sue localities, right? And so earlier, he had ignored it as a lawyer. But once he had the data, he realized, wow, we got to go deal with this. And they went and they dealt with it, but they said, I wonder if there are any other illegal, illicit hookups to the storm sewer system. How are we going to figure that out? And they brainstormed. And somebody said, why don't we lift the manhole covers on dry days? So they lifted the manhole covers on dry days to look for running water. And they realized we can't do it all. We're going to enlist the cities, local governments in this. They all have permits. They have to get their stormwater permits. If they do this with us, we'll give them a little bit of a free, a free ride on their stormwater plans for a while. And sure enough, by all the localities except one whom they sued, starting to look for the illicit hookups, the water quality went from being swimmable 19% of the time to being swimmable 59% of the time within 5 years. Now that's where they've kind of plateaued. They still try it. Here's what's amazing. 10 years, the water is not swimmable. 10 years, the water is not yet swimmable, so they didn't meet the Charles River goal. Who got punished? Nobody. Why not? Well, and by the way, this was just an announced goal. Oh, and I forgot to tell you one thing. Every year on Earth Day, they announce the report card for the Charles River. You can go on and see you can see the Charles River report card. And every year, they report on, here's where we are, here's what we've learned about dry weather days, wet weather days, and here is what we tried, here's how well it worked, here are the problems we're seeing now. Extreme weather events has made it hard to get further cleaning, and here's what we're trying to do now. So they're now trying to get more aggressive stormwater actions by the local governments. What's fascinating to me is it is 4 presidents later, EPA is still managing that goal that never was legislated. It was just resonant and believed in by the community. So that's where I think the opportunity is. If you look at traffic safety, traffic fatalities, I think it's the same story, the same opportunities. And so you have this opportunity of reducing traffic fatalities, both the number and the rate. And it's gone down steadily with a few bumps up and down every so often, but pretty steadily. And now there's this great virtuous virus called Vision Zero. Have any of you ever heard of Vision Zero? A number of local governments have adopted Vision Zero. It started in Sweden, of all places, in 1997. And now there's dozens of cities, and they're all trying to look at their data to figure out, how do we get pedestrians not to walk looking at their cell phones and everything? What are the causes? And they've identified a bunch of practices that they think make all the difference. Let me read to you what the Vision Zero folks think is sort of the key, which is exactly the same as for the Charles River. A clear goal focused on outcomes that matter to the community, in this case, eliminating traffic fatalities and severe injuries. That gets set. Beyond that leadership, the mayors are signing off and committing to that publicly. And in addition, they're putting in place a plan and a strategy. And if they don't have one in place, they're committing to get one done within a certain time period. They're bringing key departments, police, transportation, public health together, engaging them. Key to success, cooperation, collaboration, equity, and community engagement. That's the way business gets done. And then beyond that, they complement that with a systems-based, data-informed, transparent data approach. This is accountability, if you ask me. Now, let me mention one other example briefly. Some of you may have heard of CompStat, the New York City Police Department's effort to bring down crime. And you may have heard about it in the context of the Bloomberg campaign and the stop and frisk, because that was one of the strategies used. Now, what's fascinating about the crime thing is this was not adopted, this goal was not adopted initially by Bloomberg, but Giuliani's police commissioner, a guy named Bill Bratton, who said, we're going to make the crime rate, bring the crime rate down 25% in 3 years. Shock number one about this was that that Bloomberg, that Bratton, when he tried to do this, all the local police said, wait a minute, you've been measuring police response time, not the crime rate. You can't hold us accountable for the crime rate. We can't control the crime rate. And Bratton said, I'm sorry, we're going to try and bring the crime rate down because that's what matters to the citizens. He did make the data to come in, literally got driven in every Friday night on a Lotus 123 disc. That's how long ago this got started, right? So people could look at the crime patterns and see pockets, et cetera, and the crime rate did go down. Another key, he made the precinct captain stand up in a room like this with people asking questions, looking at the data to explain, what am I doing? Why am I doing that? What does the data say? Here's what I want to do to bring it down. Who else do I need to help me? They didn't do, they did it a little bit when Bratton was police chief, but they stopped doing it. They didn't think about collateral damage. So your lecturer, your Getzen lecturer 3 years ago, Charles Ramsey, former police chief in Philadelphia, that's one of the things he talked about, is you have to look out for collateral damage. So when we talk about measurement, in the list I mentioned, you've got to be thinking about collateral damage and measuring and managing that as well as your mission-focused objectives. So that gets me to you. And it is my hope that all of you will in fact start to say, how do I make government more accountable, tapping the new technologies and analytics that are available? It is so much easier today to measure things with remote sensing, to analyze the data, to visualize the data and get it out to folks. And so there are government organizations all over everywhere that are resting on old approaches. You're the next generation. We need you. We need you to come in and think about, how do I play a purpose-advancing life? How do I get technology to help bring people together to solve problems using the data, not feeling threatened by it? There's unbelievable numbers of opportunities here. I hope each and every one of you will think about, hey, can I play a role here? Boosting accountability, boosting performance, boosting fairness, trust in government. The opportunities are amazing, and you can be that change. So thank you very much. So I'm open for questions if you're interested, have any. Yes, Hal.
I'm Hal Rainey. I'm an emeritus professor in public administration and policy. You've given us some really good examples of good goals, and you've written on how you establish good goals and the value of establishing goals. But you've also given examples of the classic problems we've had for a long time of bad goals. Do you have some general observations that you take from your examples of good goals about how we set good goals and good measures of goals that get us what we want, and how we avoid the bad goals?
My first suggestion is use common sense. I know
that.
It's one of the interesting things, if you want to stay local, the state of Georgia actually has performance measurement. And I would urge all of you to look at it and to think, does it make sense? What role could we play as citizens? What role could we play as students to actually make these more meaningful? Are people using them? The city of Atlanta used to have performance measurement and get written about as trying to use goals and measures, and I can't find them anymore. So I think, I'm not saying this is easy, but I am saying if you bring your common sense to the table and always ask folks where you're working, with whom you're working. I understand there's these archway partnerships or something. What are the goals? How are we going to know if we're making progress here? What data do we need? Not just the performance indicators, but the contextual indicators, benchmarking indicators, causal factor indicators. What data do we need? How can we get it? It's easier and easier to get it. And then how do we bring people together to look at it and brainstorm, to think about what do we do next, and then exercise the discipline. So at the federal level, for the priority goals, the law now says you have to come back every quarter and report to the public on what you do. So I think there is a cadence, there's a way of doing this, but we need to convince more and more government leaders to do it. And quite frankly, some of you may remember Martin O'Malley, who did this in Baltimore and did this in Maryland. It's not politically sexy. Martin O'Malley didn't even get 1% of the vote in the last time primary. Good government doesn't win votes. We've got to get people focused, though, on the things that we turn to government to deal with. And so I think that's the challenge. The other opportunity may be trying to get more journalists reporting on this responsibly.
Excuse me. Yes, my name is Brenda Romine. I graduated at the age of 60 in 2009.
Way to go!
And I've lived in Boston, Massachusetts for a number of years. I worked at UMass Boston.
Oh, great.
Did anybody, this is so, I'm sorry to be silly about this, but has anybody yet actually swam the Charles River?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so it's a great question. Has anyone swum? There's an annual swim in the Charles River now.
Oh, really?
Yes, and so you have the Charles River Conservancy as well as the Charles River Watershed Association. And they're trying to get more and more people, and they've realized, so one of the real challenges with the making it swimmable, because that's the goal, is when there's an extreme weather event, the bottom sediments get stirred up, and so the mercury that's down there gets stirred up. So they're actually working on, can we line a certain section so more people can swim in there? The boathouses now have flags, blue or red, if it's safe or not. They're trying to get more frequent measurement, but there's definitely a swimmers group, and it grows every year. But I'm going to go back. One of the cool things, and I think, Hal, it gets partly to your question, they built a constituency. And Earth Day, June 2019 was the last time they gave a report card. So this administration is still giving a report card because the community cares about it. And they care about it because swimmable river, that's appealing. And boating on the river, very appealing. And they, by the way, give a separate grade for swimming and boating safety, as well as an overall grade. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the amazing lecture on government accountability. You talked a lot about how federal and local governments can hold themselves accountable for their constituents, but how about how universities hold themselves accountable in their setting?
Oh, this is a fantastic question. How do universities hold themselves accountable to the students? I think that's a conversation that needs to be had. So I did work at UMass Boston for a while. I set up the Collins Center for Public Management. And at the time, and I assume it's still going on, there's a lot of talk about how do we measure universities. Now, in fact, there is a comparative measurement tool that the federal government has put together that tells things like and it's smart. Granularity is a concept you need to think about when you're thinking about building data systems. Whether it was policing or water quality or traffic fatalities, when something happens makes a difference, et cetera. But so one of the things this comparative, I'm trying to remember the name of it, it's put out by the Education Department, and it is still up there. It compares by subject, because you don't want to compare schools on all subjects, but by subject for the students who are thinking of going there in terms of cost, graduation rate, and student employment rate. So that's a thing that the federal government started to look at that I think is very useful. But when I was at UMass Boston, which has a large number of students who are returning, who didn't go to college, who went to college, high school years ago, and to work full-time or have children or whatever, to think that a 6-year graduation rate or a 4-year graduation rate is appropriate for someone who's working full-time with a family just seems unreasonable to me. So I think that the challenge is for the university to work with its community, and it's including its students, to sort of say, let's be clear about the set of objectives that we have, how we're going to measure performance on it in a way that helps people see if we're making progress or not, how to improve, and if we're not making progress, doesn't punish us, but stimulates important conversations that need to be asked and answered.
Thank you, Shelley, for your great talk. You mentioned at the end something about collateral damage. Can you give a couple examples of what you mean about how or what type of collateral damage we might need to avoid? I'm assuming that some of these other examples you have are about doing that.
So the crime, if you're trying to reduce the crime rate, right? And everybody's going to try. First of all, we probably think there's gaming in the crime statistics. I guess I don't worry about that too much because I think the gaming probably happened years ago and you can't keep increasing it. However, what they weren't looking at was police abuse statistics. And if they had brought the police abuse statistics into the CompStat meetings, the CompStat meetings where the precinct captain, the accountable official, had to get up and talk about the strategies, if they had brought the police abuse statistics into the CompStat meetings, I think they would have had less problem. Similarly, on the teaching, if you're having a lot of teachers leave the system, if your turnover rate goes high after you've done this, or if you're not looking out for measurement manipulation, that's collateral damage. You've undermined the entire integrity of the system. So I think you can anticipate that. I think you can talk to the people being measured. You can think about third-party measurement. But again, it comes down to the use of the data. So in Head Start folks would love to get data, but there's actually no good data. Right now, Head Start progress is measured. The primary tools used to measure Head Start progress are observational tools done by the teachers. Well, we got to come up with a better system for this, whether it's third-party observation or it is technology-aided assessments, gamification assessments. So thinking about that, but then also thinking about, okay, what are the problems that might show up, and not blaming people for them, anticipating it, and then managing and talking your way, and then acting your way and testing and assessing. It is a different way of doing business than actually works in government. It is so, when I tell people what I do in government, I try and get government to set goals, measure performance, use the data to figure out how to do better, and don't use it in ways that are going to make people afraid of it. They go, don't they already do that? Right? But we don't, forget government, Wells Fargo. It's like, or, hey, Boeing, really? Or I'm not going to go through all of the financials. We know that people get motivated to organizations don't necessarily set up the right kind of motivational mechanisms. We can go into journals if you want to. I'm going to digress for a moment just because I do have your attention, and then I do want to thank you all for being here in this school, taking these courses, because you are trying to make the world a better place. So thank you. I do want to take a pause and say a bit of a word about evaluations, because we have now started to say about federal grants and foundation grants that you have to adopt evidence-based practices, right? And then the federal government has created what are called What Works clearinghouses to get people to tell people what evidence is out there, and they list the studies that show a program or practice works. Here's the problem. They only report on things that work on average. All right? So there's a drug. Any of you ever hear about the drug Keytruda? See the ads on TV? Keytruda had a 30-person or 90-person trial. It was not a randomized controlled trial. It was only a one-arm trial because whatever it's trying to fix, I think it's lung cancer. It was just a small trial. It failed for 29 of the 30 people. It worked for one person. Is that a statistical anomaly or not? Well, one doctor said, let me see if that one person looks different than others. And he identified characteristics of that person that were different than others. They then did a second trial on people with those characteristics, and lo and behold, Keytruda works for them. And now 60,000 people a year live longer thanks to a failed trial because somebody didn't pay attention to the failure on average, but rather looked at the data. Similarly, reading recovery works for most students, but it doesn't work for all students. Who are the ones for whom it does not work? So as we think about evidence and evidence building and create accountability mechanisms to get more of government to use evidence, we have to build the systems that support asking the right questions and probing into the data. And when we're doing randomized trials, paying attention to everything we can learn from those trials rather than just what's working on average. And then, oh, by the way, those what works clearinghouses primarily have things that have been written about in journals, in peer-reviewed journals that are written for other academics, not for practitioners. And way too much of those time, those journals are only available to people in universities or to people, well, mostly to people who are paying for the journal. Most practitioners can't subscribe to all the journals they want to subscribe that have relevant data. How do we extract that data in a useful way and translate it so people can learn from that evidence? I will say PubMed, which does the medical stuff, has made its information much more accessible to the lay public. We need to do that for the rest of social science research.
So Dr. Metzenbaum, I want to thank you very much for this excellent talk. In my own mind, I was imagining the contents of the many things that you described, and I think I came up with a syllabus for a course on accountability and research design and vivid cases, so thank you so much. We have a wonderful reception right after this, so please join me.
I look forward to this. Thank you, everyone.